Did I say that right? I said that wrong.
Hey there, beautiful people. Welcome to FANTI, the podcast for all those complex and complicado conversations about the gray areas in our lives. I'm Tre'vell Anderson.
And I am Jarrett Hill. Coming up on the show today, we're getting right into our conversation around something that we often discuss, but have to really get into the nuances of with prison abolition. But we're queering up our episode structure this week, diving right into the FANTI with our guests. And a little later on in the show, we'll have an extended convo with our reigning FANTI MVP. She is the moment. She is Miss Shar Jossell. She'll be here for our listener feedback segment. We'll be able to chat with her about her appearances on the show as we wind down. Now, on this show, we've said many times, and I'm sure many of you say, how someone should be thrown in jail, under the jail, at the wall, whatever it is. Often afterward needing to maybe put an asterisk that we don't necessarily believe in the value of the prison system. But it's all we have, so throw Donald Trump into the depths of it. There's a complex and complicado-ness around the concept of police and prison abolition, defunding this and burning that down. So we wanted to get into it with one of our faves around these parts. He is the director of the Campus Abolition Research Lab at University of Michigan, where he's also an assistant professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. His current research and teaching broadly focus on issues of race and racism, systems of oppression, and structures of domination in U.S. higher education and its social context. Here for his third and final appearance before we shut this place down, please welcome Dr. Charles H.F. Davis. Welcome to FANTI.
What's up, y'all? Good to see you.
Welcome back.
Always a pleasure.
So you've been here multiple times. You're in our book. You're in this ecosystem of things that we have going out into the world. So we appreciate you being here one last time. We want to jump right into this conversation around abolition. When we're thinking about prison, when we're thinking about policing, where did this work really begin for you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've been, like many of us are, on our own social, racial, gender justice journeys, right? And I think I've always thought of myself as being forward thinking, being informed by, of course, a Black daddy, born in Greensboro, North Carolina, growing up in Tuskegee, Alabama. My mother's family is from Kingstree, South Carolina. And so we're very steeped in a particular version of the Black radical tradition in the South that would have it no other way, right, than to be on the front lines of racial justice movements. My Uncle John was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so I always thought of myself to be progressive in a particular version of that, right? But I remember a number of years ago that I'd made a post very similar to how you just categorized about putting somebody under the jail. And I think someone that pretty much all of us could have agreed that was supposed to be the happening. And I remember a sister, amazing friend of mine, Aisha, put on the post, she was like, "Oh, I guess you're not an abolitionist." And I was like, "Girl, what you mean? Like, I don't believe in an institution of slavery. Like, what are we talking about?" And it forced me to kind of contend with this relationship that I and many of us have, in which we are socialized to think about accountability for harm and violence being something based in retribution, right? This eye for an eye, but also that in some ways we believe the state has some sort of moral authority to determine, right, who lives and dies, whether that's sort of in a very truncated sense from, the death penalty, which I'm, vehemently against, but also in the slow sense, right? In the ways that jails can and will and do kill people very slowly and taking away aspects of their humanity. So it really forced me to kind of contend with what I thought of myself politically, but also that I lacked really a robust analysis of understanding how the jail itself, right, policing itself were fundamentally institutions rooted in white supremacy, right, rooted in patriarchy, rooted in capitalism. And I had to ask those really difficult questions of well, what does jail actually do? What does prison actually do? Right. And as, Angela Davis teaches us, it doesn't disappear social problems. It disappears human beings. So what do we make of that? And how do we sit with that in a very real sense? And what is to be gained right from that process that really doesn't do any level of restoration for the harm and violence that often happens within interpersonal relationships and often against, institutions as well.
I on this topic of prison abolition, I have a really good friend. I think he's been on the show. Dr. Jared Loggins was on our propaganda episode. And he was one of the first people in my life to, just challenged me to change my language just a little bit, think a little bit more deeper about, prisons and all of that. Now he has worked very hard over the years, and I guess I'm sort of kind of abolitionist too. Cause I get it. I'm with it. And on top of that, right, I know and love many a people who have been incarcerated, some who have, died on the inside, some who have, been able to get out and re-enter society in good ways and whatnot. Down to my immediate family, praise the Lord. So a whole lot of complex feelings around the whole prison of it all. But I just say that, one, so that Dr. Davis, for some questions that we got coming up. But we're going to take a quick break, real quick, okay? And we're going to come back and continue this fabulous discussion.
Somewhere in an alternate universe where Hollywood is smarter.
And the Emmy nominees for Outstanding Comedy Series are Jetpackula, Airport Marriott, Thruple, Dear America, We've Seen You Naked, and Allah in the Family.
In our stupid universe, you can't see any of these shows, but you can listen to them on Dead Pilot Society, the podcast that brings you hilarious comedy pilots that the networks and streamers bought but never made. Journey to the alternate television universe of Dead Pilot Society on MaximumFun.org.
Welcome back to the FANTI. We were just talking, Dr. Davis, about kind of how you got started, let's say, in this work, in this articulation around prison abolition. And we should say, right, that this episode is also part inspired by some of the feedback that we got from listeners to our 2 propaganda episodes that we did, which, had these, prison abolitionist folks, on it, talking about it. Dr. Loggins, like I mentioned before, we had Tia Oso, and then we also had Deshaun L. Harrison on the 2nd episode. And we had a listener who emailed us and basically was like, in theory, I understand prison abolition, but they were speaking from their experience as a sexual assault survivor, as somebody who is neurodivergent, about how, if we abolish prisons, how we go about holding people accountable for whatever harms or violences may occur. And so I would like to start there, and go from there. How do you think about what accountability looks like in a world without prisons, and in theory also a world without police?
Yeah, I mean, this is, perhaps the most pressing and difficult question that those who, espouse to be politically committed to abolition are forced to reconcile with. And I think a couple of things are important. So one of the things that I didn't discuss, in addition to that initial comment that Aisha gave me, was being in community with organizers outside and beyond the academy, right? Like everyday people who are working on the front lines against these particular struggles, helped me think a lot about like possibilities for accountability, right? We often think of the movement in the public sphere as a place that is itself immune from these very things that happen, but we know to be true, right? That sexual violence also takes place in movement spaces, right? That harm also occurs, but often movements deal with those things very differently, right? In large part because, one, we don't trust the institutions that have said that they're going to actually instill accountability, but also that those very institutions perpetuate the exact same harms, right? We know that police, for example, are some of the number one perpetuators of intimate partner violence, of domestic violence, of sexual assault and sexual violence, even for those who have chosen to report and disclose, right, are often re-traumatized through the investigation process, are themselves additionally subjected, right, to sexual violence. So I think part of this is to think of abolition perhaps differently than is often misunderstood about what it actually is and what we're committing ourselves to. So one, we have to accept that neither police nor prisons have stopped, right, these types of things that have happened. right? And when we think about, crime more generally, and I put that in quotes in large part because, again, the state often determines what constitutes a crime and who is constituted as criminal. That is disproportionately folks that look like you and I, right? And when people of those institutions commit the same types of violences, there is very little accountability to be had. And at best, it's usually individualized, right? It's not a system being held. It's an individual officer maybe that we say is a bad apple. So if we know that these things are not themselves wholly preventative, right? They're not deterrents from people engaging in particular types of activities. We need to then limit how we understand their actual utility in stopping those forms of harm and violence. But I think also in the specific context of sexual assault, and this is not necessarily by any means an area in which I consider myself an expert. I would really encourage folks to read Erica Miner's work and Kamaria B. Porter's work at Penn State, Jessica Harris at UCLA, and other folks who are engaging in conversations around sexual violence. But part of this is recognizing that the survivor themselves usually is not offered much more than retribution. Right. And retribution that disconnects any level of survivor-centered care or healing that actually is most useful. And we have all the evidence to suggest that, again, that process, because we are so concerned about pursuing and putting in jail the perpetrator, doesn't really concern itself about the well-being of the survivor after the fact, right? What are the types of resources and supports that they need in order to ensure that they can live a full life absent of continued and perpetual trauma? Do they have access to what we call trauma-centered and survivor-centered care, right? Those who are thinking about the longstanding implications of what will need to happen, whether that's therapy or other forms of support. And this is often a part that's like not considered concern of the investigative process, right? We often don't even ask survivors, like, what would you want in this particular moment that would make better a situation that's obviously deeply harmful. And so in the same way, also policing is not preventative, right? Policing often comes after the fact that a harm or violence has already occurred, and largely as an investigative agent in order to pursue criminal charges and to put that person behind bars. And this is across multiple contexts. Obviously, my work is sort of grounded in education, but we see this in colleges and universities all the time, right? Who even have even greater separation because we go through a conduct process that isn't necessarily attached to criminal investigations. So I think we need to be raising the questions of, like, who is this actually for, right? We know this is especially true for women of color, for trans and non-binary folks of color that are subject to sexual violence, that many of them are not first looking for police intervention, right? Or the criminal legal system to intervene, right? They need something that's actually going to help them along the way, which are not these particular apparatuses and institutions. And I think part of what gets missed in the conversation about abolition, right, is that it's not just about the abolition of prisons, jails, and police, right, to be sure. It's about ridding ourselves of a society that could have prisons, jails, and police, which is to say, when we think about this idea of safety, right, we're all socialized to believe that the presence of police is somehow about the same as the presence of safety. And we all Black here, and we know that that's not true. I feel the least safe when there's a police person in my proximity, right? But to say, well, what does it mean to create the preconditions that render us less vulnerable to harm and violence, right? What needs to happen on a college or university campus and society more generally that would prevent men from perpetuating sexual violence, right? Which is the majority of folks who are engaging in this. What is it about how we socialize and develop young men to think about power, to think about control, to think about domination as a core part of their identity, right? And the sexual conquest also being tantamount to who they are as men, that leads them often into perpetuating these types of violences. Right. So we are thinking of abolition as a process of reimagining, right? A process of thinking about society differently that does some of this preventative work, right? Preventative harm, rather than retributive harm or retributive justice that tries to administer justice after the fact, when really the only justice that could be present is that sexual violence isn't happening, right? Not that we are able to criminalize and to punish and to detain someone who has actually perpetuated that form of violence.
I appreciate that framing, because I think that so often we hear these conversations around what we are calling, quote, justice after something has happened. And often we hear people push back, and myself included, where it's like, no, justice would be this thing not having happened, right? Justice would be this person being alive. Justice would be this woman being able to make this left-hand turn without being pulled over and being put into the police station, or this person not being approached by the police and then shot and killed for no reason, et cetera. That would be justice. We're talking about accountability, right? And as we're kind of thinking about accountability from that lens, I have a hard time discussing this, and you said this is like one of the hardest questions to answer as far as like what we do and the alternate. When we're thinking about crime and punishment and like the attachment of those two things, it's so interesting to me because one, we've talked about here on the show years before. I said something to the effect of like, the law is not reflective of what is right or wrong. The law is reflective of who is in power. Right. And I think that in the last year and a half, we've definitely seen that come to bear when we're thinking about not even Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is his own situation, but like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about abortion. Right. And when we've seen the law starting to change, when we see public sentiment being what it is, in the well above 2/3 of Americans supporting a woman's right to choose and having access to that care. It's not about abortion being right or wrong. It's about who's empowered and who's making the decisions about what we get to do and what we don't. Right. And so when we think about crime being a social construct in and of itself, right, the morality piece gets added on to the actions by the systems that we live in. But when we think about punishment as an attachment to crime, punishment is also one of those things where like it looks different in every single instance, right? We see Donald Trump being able to be on world tour, right, and doing all kinds of crazy things and defying courts and all of these different things, and punishment looking one way for him as opposed to if it were you or I. And so when we're rethinking crime and punishment, how do we think about this from examples that we see in other places where it's more of a rehabilitative kind of response? Or I'm always fascinated by the way that we use language about the penal system, which is about penalty, right? Or the Department of Corrections, which is supposed to be about correcting behavior or correcting the way that people are engaging the world, but does not ever seem to do a good job of doing that. When we're thinking about crime and punishment, what kinds of examples do we have of other ways to be able to engage people who have, quote, committed crime?
Yeah, I mean, you raised so many important points, and I did not know that Professor Hill has subsequently become a critical legal studies scholar, but I'm here for it. Right?
Listen,
Right?
there's been some growth since we've met. There's been some growth.
Come on, Professor Hill. I'm with it. Yeah, I mean, so this is an interesting thing, right? I think, again, one, I want to sort of restate, right, that, as abolitionists, as those who confront issues of state and state-sanctioned violence, like, we fundamentally don't believe the state has any moral authority to determine, right, what accountability looks like, in large part because it has designed itself to perpetuate these harms and violences, bring up your point, as those who are in positions of power. It's exactly why it would take as long as it would have taken, right, for someone like R. Kelly to be held accountable, given his particular power and status, despite those constant, denunciations, those recognitions of his years of engaging in various acts of sexual violence, of grooming, et cetera, so forth and so on, right? We can run the list. Diddy, like, these things are continuing to come up. And so I think part of that, one would have to recognize what is the role of what we would call like restorative and transformative justice in this process. And minimally, right, it's that we would actually ask those who have incurred the harm or injury, right, what it is that they would like to see. Now, part of that limitation is, again, we've all been socialized to believe police, prisons, and jails are the solution. And so it wouldn't be surprising, and in fact, it's not surprising that some might say that is actually the first thing that I need. But we also know, just on a very base level, right, when harm is done to us, we are first inclined to do harm to the person that did harm to us, right? That's our first sort of visceral, humanistic sort of relationship. But we proxy that, right, when we say the state gets to determine it. And this is how we often find, if I can use sort of a parallel, so many levels of disappointment, right, when these police officers are indicted, but then ultimately not convicted, right, or not indicted. Right. We saw this just recently with, those who are responsible for murdering Elijah McClain, right, that nothing's going to happen to them. And part of it is that the system isn't necessarily always going to turn on itself unless it can scapegoat an individual. But also we're left relatively empty, right, when those things even do happen, quote unquote, in our favor. Right. Because, again, in relationship to the police violence specifically, the justice isn't holding those who killed Breonna Taylor accountable in the court. It's that Breonna Taylor is still here. Right? It's that George is still here. It's that Tre'vell is still here. And so I think from a restorative standpoint, it's like, what would actually make us whole in the absence of the thing that never should have created the whole for us in the first place? And part of that might be, in a system as it may be capitalistic, is some sort of verdict, right? That renders some sort of funds that come typically from these police associations and or the public purse, which is also part of the problem, right, is that we're taking dollars to cover the asses of police who have committed injustices, right? But that in some way that's compensatory, right? Black Lives Matter, grassroots, which is very distinguishable from Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. I want to be very clear about this, right? And working with the family of Andrew Joseph III down in Florida. And Andrew Joseph III was a teenage boy who was, in some regards, pretextually stopped and engaged at a state fair in Hillsborough County, was subsequently discharged from the fair at the discretion of the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, left on the side of the road and killed by a motorist some years ago. They were actually able to render a $15 million verdict as a consequence of the negligence of that department. Now, to be sure, that does not bring Andrew Joseph and Deanna Joseph their son back, right? But what it does do, right, is allow for some level of accountability for a place that said it was completely uninvolved, right? That their negligence should be disregarded by the court. And it allows us to poke yet another chink in the armor of this system that does not want to hold itself accountable. And for them, that was a form of restoration, right? Given the protracted struggle that they have been engaged with, the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of legal fees, and other things they're working to do to support other families. So I think part of it is a deference to those who themselves, right, fall victim to harms and violence, as opposed to being deferential to a criminal legal system or a state that doesn't often have the same interests at heart of those individuals. I think another aspect of this from a transformative standpoint is what actually happens in these places, right, that actually makes some level of rehabilitation even possible, right? And we can critique the idea of rehabilitation later. But what we often know to be true is that jails and prisons have equally, if not worse, conditions than what everyday people are subjected to in their lives. So you have some folks, right? And we'll take those who have been, if we think about the work of Equal Justice Initiative and finding those who have been wrongly convicted, but have spent dozens of years in a jail or a prison, right? Or we think about Khalif Browder, right? Who remained in Rikers and had not been charged, and ultimately it takes his life, right? We are putting folks who, we won't talk about necessarily deservingness, right? But folks who have no otherwise relationship to criminalization or crime or violence into a context that ultimately produces them to be more violent as a method of survival, right? You have folks who come out who are not the same as they were when they went in, and often it's not because they're better, or if they are, it's mentally through, the present threat or the use of force by corrections officers and a system that dehumanizes you at every single turn to force you into compliance. So I think we need to also understand what those things do. And to your question about how this might look in other places, right? To be sure, I don't think jails and prisons should exist anywhere in the world, but not everywhere in the world, right, are they rooted in profiteering like they are here. Many of the prisons are rooted in the ability to create profits for shareholders, right? That they are publicly traded, that they are actually taking on labor functions, right? We know in California, where you all are as well, we have formerly incarcerated folks who are fighting fires in California for like less than $1 a day, right? We have those who are incarcerated working for companies like Whole Foods and others in the fields, right, to get produce that we often buy off the shelves, who are working in suboptimal conditions and not compensated in any particular way. In the same form of convict leasing, as we understood it, right? This development of prisons out of the abolition of slavery, finding ways to criminalize Black folks to reintroduce them as slaves vis-a-vis the penal system, right? That's what the 13th Amendment is about. It's the sort of only condition by which slavery can still exist, right? That we're doing some version of convict leasing still that is helping private corporations drive up their profits, helping, those who are invested in prisons drive up their profits as well. So that mechanism is something we have to question of, like, what is the prison actually for? Because it's not primarily, if at all, for any level of rehabilitation, right? It's for creating a different labor and workforce that we can sort of endlessly exploit so that we can benefit on the profiteering side as private corporations.
I so appreciate the way that you brought that back together at the end, that this is not necessarily about crime or punishment. It's not about wanting people to be better or getting people justice or accountability. It's about making money. It's about suppressing groups of people. There's a lot of different things that it is about, and it is not about what we're thinking it's about.
And this is why we don't address root causes. Right. I just want to say that really quickly, right? Like, if we really cared about this, and this is the thing about that sort of social construct of crime, but also the social determinants of crime, right? And so part of this is, one, recognizing that, well, if we think that police actually stop or prevent crime, right? Well, those in the most heavily policed areas, or rather the least policed areas, right, aren't producing crime. But part of it's because they have access to resources, right? They have stability of housing. Right? They have financial resources by which they can attain nutritious food. They have quality education systems, right, built largely on the property and tax base. And yet, and still, with the heavily police presence in a lot of under-resourced or pillage-resourced areas, right, crime is persistent, and we're not trying to address those root causes. We're not trying to give people universal basic income, as is trying to be advanced in some places like Stockton, California, when Michael Tubbs was the mayor, right? And so I think we also have to question that, like, what are the conditions that necessitate crime? And part of it is that, as Kiese Lehman, who's an amazing Black writer from Jackson, Mississippi, encourage everybody to read, is that Black people and people that are in abject poverty are not given healthy choices. Right? What are you supposed to do when you can't put food on your table, when you can't provide for your family, you can't take care of yourself? Right? We see this in LA immensely, right? We have any number of places in downtown Los Angeles that could actually serve as housing for the folks that are on Skid Row, right? The folks that are increasingly unhoused and displaced. But what do? We keep them empty, right? Because the corporation that owns that particular property can take a loss, write it off, and continue to move on, because we actually don't want to address that. We'd rather criminalize or like sweep the encampment, right? We don't want to address root causes of addiction, so forth and so on. So again, like, we are committed to the manufacturing of the social determinants of crime that, again, necessitate our need to have policing, to have prisons, to have jails, ultimately to, again, this exploitable labor force.
You just said something that brought back one of my favorite lines from a show called Little Fires Everywhere with Kerry Washington and Reese Witherspoon. There's a moment where Reese, as this rich white woman, says to Carrie Washington's character, that, wow, right, already. Something to the effect of, she's a better mom because she made better choices. And Kerry Washington says back to her, no, you had better choices, right? You had better opportunities to choose between. And so I just think that's a really important point.
I wanted to bring up, one of the things that, at least for me on my journey towards abolition, that was, a pit stop, was this idea of prison reform, right? As opposed to prison abolition, and that supposedly, right, being the way to change circumstances for the better. And, I think one of the things that I often was told and have since witnessed, right, is that, everybody talk about reform, but reforms never actually happen so often. And I wonder, though, how you kind of articulate the difference between some of these efforts that we have seen by, folks who have elected to go, the governmental institutional route with prison reform versus some of the things that you are articulating around, outright abolition and reframing how we think about crime and punishment altogether.
I think there's an argument to be had on all sides here, right? Now, I don't agree with the reformist position because part of it is that reform is always subject to political interest, and those are contested and competing, right? So in some ways, it's a zero-sum game. And we've seen this, across our lifespan, but also across history, that for whatever progress is made, right, and it may be Donald Trump, since we've already brought him up, and his administration and the consequences of those decisions have happened, is that those things can be rolled back very quickly, right? We just saw, right, with the, basically abolition of Roe, right, if I can do a little tongue in cheek here, right, is that something that was supposed to be like just established case law that wasn't supposed to move is completely gone now, right? So when we take a reformist approach, I think this goes back to your, critique, Professor Hill, right, is that, right, that it's ultimately about power, right? That the law itself is a tool that was not only just contrived from the roots of power of white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, et cetera, but one that continues to do so. And so when we attempt to address things through the criminal legal system, we know that that comes with a set of limitations. And I think reformist politics around jails and prisons and police have shown us just to be that, right? A reform for police was to wear body cameras. Now we just got videotapes of you whooping our ass. But we don't have anything beyond like, actually reduction of the threats. You feel me? Right? And so I think we have to put this into context of what the reform is actually meant to do. And again, it's going to be a zero-sum game, and it's hardly going to be preventative. And so there's this sort of contestation of what we call like reformist reforms, which are the ones I just spoke about, and these non-reformist reforms, which are, I think, a bit more thoughtful in its abolitionist understanding. And so as one example, one reform to jails and prison is related to overcrowding. And this is a thing, again, in California, but Arizona, Florida, other big prison states that they're trying to deal with. And the reformist solution to overcrowding is what? build more jails, build more prisons. Now, we know to be true, if they build it, they will fill it. And part of how they're filling it is being able to create these sort of models that assess what is the third grade reading level, right, across minoritized populations that will help us depict, based on their literacy standard, who is likely to go to prison or jail, right? And we're doing this in advance. We saw this especially, in LA in recent years, even that, one of the sort of really good data points on this is that the number one provider of mental health and emotional health services are not therapists and psychiatrists. They are prisons and jails. So again, going back to root causes, right? And so we'd rather spend billions of dollars, right? 60% of some municipal budgets on, increasing policing, prisons and jails as some sort of reformist measure to address issues and gaps in mental and emotional health coverage. But what is that actually doing? Mostly nothing. And so I think part of it is knowing that this is a much slower and incremental change that ultimately I think will never bring about the thing that we are asking for. There's also a sort of what we call survival pending revolution, right? What happens in the meantime. And I think we have to be more politically courageous, morally courageous, to think about envisioning a thing that would limit the need or capacity for prisons to exist altogether. And I think part of what gets misunderstood about abolition as well is that all we care about is destruction, right? We just want to destroy and burn down every single thing. And albeit very much true in a certain sense, we are more concerned about what is that we're going to build, right? And Ruthie Gilmore, who's a racial geographer who's very widely known and cited in the abolitionist space, talks about this idea of abolition being about presence and not absence, right? It's about the presence and the building of life-affirming institutions. And if we know to be true that prison and jail limit one's life-making opportunities, right? It limits their life-making capacity as those who are incarcerated, then what might stand in its place that's actually life-affirming? Right? Again, what are those preconditions that we can help create through a social safety net that has continued to get smaller and smaller and smaller that would limit the possibility, right, of folks having to engage with criminal behavior, criminal activity? Again, going back to that school setting, why is it that for those students who are often missing school, right, and the number one thing for students who are suspended or expelled is truancy, right, missing school, somehow our solution for you missing school is to keep your ass out of school, right? You ain't been here, so we're going to suspend you anyway. That for folks who are from working class environments where their parents are working, then what is that child supposed to do during that day? Probably going to get into some stuff. And that's part of how we think about that school to prison pipeline trajectory, which again, we can talk about at a different point. That makes possible why we would be invested in not addressing the base level solutions and the root causes, but trying to get, again, something done after the fact that feeds into this system.
What you just said there, I think makes me at least want to say that I think one of the greatest struggles to more people adopting an abolitionist, perspective and framework, is ultimately the fact that like they don't trust their imagination, right? They don't trust an ability to think differently, to imagine something different than what we have been given. And I say that because, I think I was just thinking as you were talking about, when I think about my journey in terms of like, at least articulating publicly, like on my other show, we are always talking about some sort of crime related thing, some sort of court case, Young Thug and RICO charges in Georgia or whatever. And one of my co-hosts, Josie Duffy Rice, is, I think it's safe to say I think she's an abolitionist. She always talks about she hate cops, we don't like prisons and all of that. And so been very public in that particular space in terms of like saying, yeah, prisons are wrong. We need to figure out other ways to address whatever it is we say we're trying to address. But I do think most people just can't or don't, for various legitimate reasons in the ways that we've all been reared and socialized, right, trust their imagination to be able to consider something different. And I think once folks begin to trust that possibility a lot more, it makes it a lot more easier to embrace abolitionist politics, or even further think differently about how gender shows up in the world. And we can add on all of these other things that come from freeing oneself from the ways that we've all been socialized.
Well, so I think this is really, really interesting. I really appreciate you, Tre'vell, for bringing this up. And this is one of the things that I talk about with my students often, because we deal with like the idea of the radical imagination. We build out of Robin D.G. Kelly's work, who's an amazing historian at UCLA, wrote a book called Freedom Dreams I encourage everyone to read. And I think there's two parts of this. So one, I think, is that we have so many examples, right? And history teaches us that we have always had imagination that has been able to set us free, right? Abolitionists, in, at least in the United States, being rooted in the emancipation of those who were enslaved, right? That abolition was always at the very beginning and at the very end of that journey, right? From the very first site of resistance, when we were first intended to be captured, for those who thought it not robbery to, as we've seen in the movie Black Panther, right, to find themselves at the bottom of the sea, then to be held into captivity and bondage. But that those who were enslaved had to imagine themselves as free, in part because they had already been free prior to being enslaved. And I offer that in part in that when we think about the work of cultural production and artists, and I know there's a big conversation about, Beyonce and what she is and what she isn't, and we ain't going to have that conversation today. But part of that amplification tool, and as Tony K. Bombara teaches us as well, right, is the role of the artist is to make the revolution look irresistible. And part of that is expanding our imagination and possibility and inviting more people into that conversation to experience those lived realities that are often created by subcultures or maligned or marginalized cultures that also frees them themselves, right? Like the freest thing that I experience in the way I understand gender, even perform gender, right, is not through the particular mechanisms that socialize me into manhood in a specific way. It was actually expanding my engagement and understanding and relations with folks whose gender presentations were differently, right, whose sexualities were differently, and all these other things that no longer made me a sort of existing in a space of arrested development. And so I also offer that in thinking that, well, if we think it's so difficult to imagine something new, I want us to consider that we actually live in someone's imagination right now. Right? That someone had to imagine a world that was built in white supremacy, right? That was rooted in patriarchy, that was rooted in ableism, and they were able to create it, right? Colonialism has a huge part to play. Again, another conversation for another day. So if we exist in someone's radical imagination right now, right, how is it impossible for us to radically imagine something different that we can actually come into existence? And we've seen that in part the evolution of, the sort of the art and production space is the extent to which things that are often subcultures or rendered subcultures rather become mainstream. Right? You don't see something like Renaissance become whatever it is, right, in the absence, one, of a platform that allows for it to be in that space. But if it wasn't first imagined, right, by queer folks in the ballroom scene, right, that imagination already existed. It hasn't become popularized until recently. And this, I think, similarly, right, that Pose coming at a particular moment into the public sphere also expands that imagination and possibility. So I want us to actually give ourselves more credit, right? That like we come from a lineage and a tradition that has always imagined something different, even if it has been within the confines of the system in which we existed, right? High on the Hog is like, also an amazing example of that, right? Of how we think about the role of food and telling of stories and the sustainability of Black folks. And even that, right, is a part of an exercise of imagination that takes also that from which the past that cannot be forgotten and brings it into the present so that we can ultimately be entire and whole human beings, even if it's on a limited space.
You think you smart, don't you, Charles? You think you smart. You think you know something.
I mean, y'all invite me back, so I'm doing something right.
Listen, since you got your fucking degree and think you know everything. No, I love this conversation about the imagination that the two of you have brought up, because I remember hearing a number of years ago, like, everything that man has created was once an idea, right? And like the way that landed in me, like, and we've talked so much here about like having ideas and seeing them come to fruition, whether it be this show, whether it be, the book, or the various different things that we've created throughout the world, throughout our careers, and put into the world. And like, when we have this conversation around defund, I think so many people get scared of the idea of like taking the money away from the police or taking the money away from anything, right? But I think when we have this conversation around the ideas, right, around the imagination, you talked about so many different data points about like where we can look at reading at third grade reading levels and determine where people are more likely to go to prison. And like, if we could have some imagination about what we could do with the money that we're sending to police, we could better educate those students so that they could be above a third grade reading level and have less propensity to go to jail. If we were able to look at homelessness and the people that are experiencing homelessness, we could have a better idea about ways that we could imagine a world for them that would be better, where they're not necessarily having to live on the street, whether they choose to or whether it is something that that was forced upon them, right? And so all of these various different ways that we engage policing and prison and like the prison industrial complex, as we call it, like there are ideas for how to do these things better. There are ideas, there's imagination around how we can take that money and use it in other ways that are much more valuable and restorative and rehabilitative and really work toward justice, and not just this idea that we have about accountability. I want to give you the last word here before we wrap up, because I see you nodding, and I know you probably have something else that you wanted to offer us here before we go.
Well, I mean, that's occupational hazard, right? Like, we can sit here and talk endlessly about these things. So, I want to encourage folks to understand that abolitionist possibilities are closer than they are further away, right? 5 years ago, we weren't having a conversation on the national stage about defunding or divestment. And to be sure, right, the call isn't just to defund the police, it's that we can reinvest those dollars into infrastructure, into social support, so forth and so on. But that also this work is already taking place and taking root in a number of places, even here in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, and Washington County, that there are a number of what they're calling care-based safety coalitions who are challenging this idea that police should be the place to which we should first turn, right, as first responders. Because to be truthful, we ask way too much of police to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. And that's part of how they're able to pillage the public purse and get these resources. But even in this era of defund, despite all of the political rhetoric that we've only seen increases in police spending coming out of the Biden-Harris administration on the federal level and also on local and municipal levels. But we have these initiatives that are standing up programs that are allowing us to have alternative numbers than 911, right, to call, which is going to be, again, at the discretion of who wants to route that to police. It's actually going to go to, a trauma-based care center. We can have different types of interventionists and responders, opposed to police who might show up on the scene to a mental health or emotional health concern, escalate it, and then somehow someone else ends up dead as a consequence of that, right? And so there are people who have and are always working in this, and we just need to sort of know and turn our attention, right, turn our gaze to that direction to actually invest in the work. It's not something that anyone is going to do for us. A big thing we say in abolition is that we keep us safe. Right. Mm-hmm. And I know that you both know, given your positionalities and where you've shown up in the world, right, that the community has kept y'all safe more than any institution or apparatus of the state always has. Right. And as marginalized people, we know that to be true as well. Right. Those who were enslaved first kept themselves safe. Right. They kept their children safe. They kept them at distance and not subject to the types of harm that was subjected to them by, slave owners and slave drivers. And so, again, we have examples of this, right? And I think if we are just committed enough to both study and struggle, as Robin Kelly talks about and a number of other folks, right, that we can figure this thing out. But again, we have to have the political and moral courage, know that nobody is going to do us for us, and that we must take responsibility as a community to engage in collective care that will render the world obsolete of its necessity of police.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been really, really fantastic.
My pleasure.
I'm grateful that we got to have you back on the show. Tell people where they can connect with you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, you can connect with me on Twitter. His mama calls him Twitter, so I'm going to keep calling him Twitter. At HF Davis, Instagram at HF Davis as well. You can find more work that we're doing here at the University of Michigan at the Campus Abolition Research Lab, campusabolition.org.
Also wanted to shout out Charles as a fantastic creative and photographer and cook and artist. I want to point out that your backdrop has changed since the last time you were on FANTI, and I appreciate your shelves and what you're giving on the shelves. We appreciate that as well.
Pleasure is mine.
We want to hear from y'all. Hit us up on social media using the hashtag FANTIFam. We are on the Twitter X, the Instagram, the TikTok, the YouTube, all at FANTI Podcast. Coming up, a very special listener feedback section and all that coming up next.
Hello, sleepyheads. Sleeping with Celebrities is your podcast pillow pal. We talk to remarkable people about unremarkable topics, all to help you slow down your brain and drift off to sleep. For instance, we have the remarkable Neil Gaiman.
I'd always had a vague interest in live culture, food preparation.
Sleeping with Celebrities, hosted by me, John Moe, on MaximumFun.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Night-night.
So as we get ready to wrap up FANTI, we could not have anybody on the show to say farewell in a way that we have Shar Jossell coming on to say goodbye on the show. So we have her back to say one more thing here on the show. We wanted to take a walk down memory lane, our favorite moments with the one, the only.
Is that the name of the segment? One More Thing with Shar Jossell.
One more thing, yes. Shar Jossell, welcome back to FANTI one more time.
And you see, we know how to do it right. Me, Tre'vell, and Michael, we know how to do it right.
See, he always does it wrong.
No, but in all seriousness, I want to thank you both for having me on the myriad of times. It's very early. I feel like my voice is in the basement. I'm feeling very Mariah Carey, darling. But I want to thank you both for having me on for one last time because, this is one of my favorite shows to listen to and one of my favorite shows to talk back to in the shower and when I'm getting dressed and one of my favorite shows to be on with two of my favorite people. So thank you.
Thank you, Shar. I one of the things that I appreciate is I remember you were the first person that we called to do like we have to do something different this week. I think it was like 2 or 3 episodes and we were like, we have to talk about Wendy. And I think Wendy Williams had just said something about men wearing dresses and how y'all need to stop wearing our clothes. And we were like, wearing our clothes. And we were like, we have to talk about this. And we're like, who else could we possibly have but Shar? And like now you've been on the show 68,000 times in 195 episodes or whatever it is. What has been one of the moments that has stuck out to you the most of being on FANTI?
Oh, for being on FANTI. Okay, so I'd honestly say it's that first time that I was on. I remember the rush of excitement, how thrilled I was for the both of you with launching a new show and then, tapping me to talk one of my favorite people and all her messiness. That was my hallmark. Out of all of the times that I've been on this show, appeared on this show, lent my voice to the show, that first appearance, there was something special because there was something new a brewing. It was something in the air with this show. So, for me, it was the debut, honey. How I'm doing?
Yes, Shar is always, a good person. Any pop culture topic, right? Any, I don't care. Shar can go deep. All right. Shar has this, I call it a steel trap memory. Okay. Shar can tell you what you was wearing. She can tell you where you was. She can tell you what you had to eat. She can tell you. Shar has details, not just, I'm a surface level queen. I know a lot about I know a little about a lot. Shar knows a lot about a lot. Okay. And so we can always pick up the phone for Shar.
You probably know this better than me. There's one actress who has like a memory where she can remember every date. And it's like Mary Lou someone, older white woman. Retton Henner, I was going to say.
Is it Mary Lou Renner? Is that her name?
I was going to say, we've said like 3 versions of whatever that last name is. But like.
Or something like that. Mm-hmm.
She can remember like, January 3rd, 1987, that was a Thursday. And I did such and such, and it was like, what? I feel like you're like a click over from being able to pull that. How do you do that? Like, what is that?
Well, Jarrett, I don't know. I think it's just the way my mind works. Like I was just sharing I think I was telling Tre'vell on Thanksgiving, like, I just went to go meet Jada Pinkett Smith a few weeks ago. And randomly, when I was at Barnes & Noble at the Grove, this is randomly, he had nothing to do with it, nothing. But I was the only person that clocked him. I look up, I'm on the 2nd floor. It's Ime Udoka. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but the Boston Celtics coach that cheated on Nia Long.
Wow.
He's at the Barnes & Noble. And I was the only one that clocked him. But he saw that I saw that he knew that I knew who he was. So it's the way my mind, it's just the way it works. I can't describe it. I wish I could.
Oh my God.
I just want to point out right here, because you said he was a basketball head coach. And I was like, well, why did you know him? And you said, he's the one that cheated on Nia Long. I was like, oh, there we go.
There you go.
It went viral. He's very attractive too. But Jarrett, I can't answer that question. It's just the way my mind works. It's the way I compartmentalize things. And I think it might even go back to like even the way I studied in school. Right. I always do word association. That's how I even remember people's names. Like, so I can't describe it, but I'm not as good as that actress that you brought up. I'm not nearly as good as her.
I think back to, so we should say, we just had Michael on. Everybody heard that episode, Thanksgiving episode. And so Michael says that, he was competing with you for, the most appearances on the show. Although it's not really a competition because, like, what number you had 7, 8, something like that.
Yeah, I'm up there. I lost track after after the phone just kept ringing. I just kind of stopped counting.
She said once I became an official contributor, we stopped the count. So I just couldn't tell you. I don't know.
Yeah,
I remember the Clubhouse episode Us doing that on Clubhouse with Corice, COR.ECE, wherever you get Slayworthy audio.
Oh my God.
I remember doing the Clubhouse episode and being so happy that we had you in that conversation, because Clubhouse was such a situation back when it was out, and like us trying to do that together. You were going to say something else about something else you loved about being on the show, and I wanted to make sure we made space for that.
I think I just appreciated that every time you all had me on, the subject matter was so wildly different. I know that you all have both referenced like the summer of 2020 when Tre'vell could hear the protesters outside of their apartment window. And I remember like that episode was so different from other things I had contributed to, because I talked to you all in the summer of 2020 about activism and people's respective lanes and how we all can't be on the front lines. We all serve in our own individual strengths when it comes to something like that. But the Clubhouse episode, I was a staple on Clubhouse. You know, I had a little moderate following, but Clubhouse it feels like a fever dream at this point. Like that's an episode that I oftentimes forget that I did with you all, because Clubhouse does not seem real to me as we go into 2024. Like that whole era of PTR and, you know, arguing with, I'm arguing with Tiffany Haddish about the vaccine.
Yeah.
Like it just does not seem real. So I forget all about that.
I'm remembering a lot of conversations about moan rooms and like all kinds of crazy.
In that episode, we were doing it live on Clubhouse and recording it for the podcast at the same time. So we was, you know, muting and unmuting. It was a
dance.
It was an experience. We are innovators, okay?
Well, Shar, Michael talked about having connected with listeners to the show and having heard from people about his appearances on the show. What kind of feedback have you gotten from listeners or people who've, you know, kind of checked you out either on this show and also on We See Each Other, the podcast?
What's so funny, right? Shout out to We See Each Other, the podcast. Shout out to Learning Out Loud, which is a term that you all coined that I keep regurgitating. And shout out to Tre'vell for teaching me. I told Tre'vell I keep using paradox, okay? I know paradox, but Tre'vell has been saying it a lot. So I say paradox in even when it doesn't apply. I'm like, the paradox of the bell pepper versus the jalapeno.
She said it works everywhere.
It works everywhere. What was your question, Jarrett? You see, I just keep running my mouth. I just forgot that fast.
About the feedback that you've gotten from people about being on our show and on We See Each Other.
So that's so what I find fascinating is a lot of people haven't like written me about the shows. It's not like there's a peppering of people that'll tweet or that'll email, but most people run up on me in person. And not in a bad way, but it's like I have been recognized from FANTI in person. Like I've been behind people in line at certain events and they're like, oh, I was trying to piece together where I heard your voice and you was the girl that was boop, 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 boop. So the FANTI fam is in the streets. And for whatever reason, they don't email or really tweet or contact me. But if they happen to see me in person or meet me, that's their intro to me, is some wild or wacky thing I've said on you all's platform. And so it's like, you know, we know each other. We're friends through the audio. So that's what it's been like. It's all been great though.
I just want to say, like, I think about how being in the grocery store, if I was like on the aisle next to you and I heard you speaking, I would be like, what is happening? Is that? Exactly. And like, I imagine listeners doing the same thing.
Yes, I'm telling you, it happens in mysterious ways. I'm like, let me shut up. I'll be on FaceTime venting to my mom about something and someone's like, wait a minute, where I know you from, baby? Where I know you from, niece? You know, type thing. So, and you all have the FANTI fam, it runs a spectrum. It runs a gamut. There is no one demographic, at least from who's run up on me. That is a FANTI, you know, fammer. It's all over the place. It's great.
Oh my God. What other episode did you do? Oh, you did the Daytime Talk episode that we did with Ryan Mitchell. That was a fun one.
I actually want to follow up on that because the Daytime Talk episode was one that I really, really enjoyed. We did that in September. It's funny because since doing that show, I watch Sherry a lot more. I know you're not watching as much Sherry, but like, how are you feeling following up on Daytime Talk before we wrap up here?
So my feelings are pretty much, okay, shout out to that episode because I was talking to Swish and I said, why was my mic so damn loud? I just felt like I was yelling, right? Even though Swish was like, no, that wasn't the case. But nevertheless, the Daytime Talk episode, my feelings have kind of like, I watch Sherry. I've tuned into Sherry. I like Sherry aspects of Sherry, but Jarrett, I've DM'd Jarrett. Tre'vell, you don't know this. I've DM'd Jarrett in the name of that episode because Sherry does something with her inflections that really get on my nerves. I think it's a fun show, but like, I don't like Sherry's like serious interview voice, and we want to
Oh, Lord.
extend our deepest whatever to like, there's just certain things about Sherry that feel a little performative to me, but I enjoy her. Jennifer Hudson's show, my feelings are pretty much still the same. Iconic theme song.
I think it's gotten worse.
Yeah, and I don't like to compare, but the star of the Clarkson sisters, as they call Kelly and a few other talented white women. I don't like to compare American Idol talk show hosts.
Not the Clarkson.
Yeah, that's for the white girls. Yeah, that's for the white girls. They got the Clarkson sisters. Her, Tori Kelly, but Kelly Clarkson is the lead, so it's the Clarkson sisters.
The Clarkson sisters is sending me.
But I say that to say I don't like to compare American Idol hosts, but I just my feelings around Jennifer's show has not changed, and I totally forgot about Karamo.
Mm-hmm.
I know we talked about Karamo's show as well. I don't see anyone really talking about it. I know that there's a clip that surfaced that went viral on TikTok where people are like, superimposing, like they took the guest out of the chair. And now it's like what the dating scene looks like. And now they put the guest at the Red Lobster, and whatever they were saying, like, take me out of the game. Da, 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 da. So I say that to say, I know I'm talking in circles, and you all know that I ramble. My feelings around the talk show episode have not really changed, but I still, right after this, I will be sitting down with Whoopi and Joy and Sarah Haynes and Sunny Hostin and Alyssa Farrah Griffin and the girls. And I just ordered my new mug too. So just, it hasn't changed.
We appreciate you so much for lending your voice, lending your talent, lending that encyclopedic brain, and all of the joy that you bring to the show. And we are so grateful for it. We hope that the audience follows you and gets to continue to see what you do next, because we know that this is only the beginning for you. So thank you so much for being here.
And we know you're cooking up stuff, as always. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I am. And again, I want to thank you all. This has been such a fantastic run, and thank you all for contributing to the conversation in such an informative and educational and funny way, in only the way that you all can. I'm going to miss this show. I truly, truly am. And so go out with the bang. You all know what to do.
Damn. Shar Jossell, tell people where they can find all the work that you're doing and how they can keep up with you.
You can find me everywhere at Shar Says So. That's Shar with an S, SHAR says so. You can also visit my website, which is under construction, but you can learn more about me there, sharsaysso.com or sharjossell.com. It'll take you to the same page. And yeah, I'm excited for 2024 as well, because as Tre'vell mentioned, I got some stuff cooking too. So that's where you can find me.
All right. Y'all can check out Shar also on all the episodes of We See Each Other, the podcast. All of those episodes are streaming right now. You can check them out.
We have been telling y'all every single week that if you would like to share some thoughts, some feelings about the FANTI, you can go to speakpipe.org/FANTI to do that. It allows you to do a quick little voice memo. That way we can hear potentially some of you all's voices on the show in a couple weeks. This is the last week to do it now. Okay, you've been putting it off. I know you have. But this the last week to do it, because we prepping the final episodes. Okay? So go on to speakpipe.org/FANTI and send us your voice memo. And listen, if you don't want to talk to us, we get it. You can also send us an email at FANTI@MaximumFun.org, and we'll get those as well. Okay, now it is time for our dishonorable mentions. These are stories of people that caught our attention this week, either for their good or for their stupid. I will get us started and go first. I want to first say shout out to all of y'all in the FANTI fam who listened to the 50th anniversary episode that we did about hip hop. I should say the 50th anniversary of hip hop episode that we did with Cecily and Pierre from the Purse First podcast. I told y'all I listened to them for real. And so it's been great to hear over the last few weeks them reading out new reviews that they've gotten with folks who say, heard y'all on FANTI, love the podcast, da 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 da. So shout out to all y'all who are, spreading the love over over to our friends over there at Purse First, where they discuss the girls and the gays that rap. And then I had a quick honorable mention. I have discovered that as I get older, both emotionally and physically and spiritually, that I actually really love a holiday movie, like a Black Christmas movie. Give it to me. I don't care. I know the acting's not necessarily gonna be, Academy Award worthy in that particular way, but I know it's gonna be a good time. I know it's going to be enjoyable. I know I'm going to laugh. I'm going to feel great. And I want to shout out one of the new contributions to the Black holiday movie situation. And that is Candy Cane Lane, which is on, I think that's on the Prime. This is the one with Eddie Murphy and Tracy Ellis Ross and David Allen Greer.
Danielle Pinnock.
Who?
Pinnock, one of our friends, is in this as well.
Yes, Danielle Pinnock. Shout out to our Historically Black Phrases interviewee. It's a really cute holiday movie, that you can add it to the queue right after, almost Christmas, right before last holiday. Something like that. You know what I mean?
I'm with it. Okay. I want to give my honorable mention. First off, how there are those shows that when they come out, you're like, oh, I'm absolutely going to watch that. And then 5 minutes later, you're like, how are we already in season 3? And I ain't seen this. That has been my experience with The First Wives Club, starring Jill Scott, Michelle Buteau, and Ryan Michelle Bath. I saw this show debut and I was like, oh, I've got to watch that.
Buffet.
I'm sorry?
It's Ryan Michelle Buffet.
Sorry.
That's Sterling K. Brown wife.
Shout out to her.
In case y'all didn't know.
I saw this show debut and I was like, oh my God, I got to watch that. That looks perfect. And never got to it. And now the show has moved from BET to Netflix and there's a new season of it. And so I've just started it at season 1 and I watched half of the first season in one night. On the couch, sick under a blanket and cackling. The show is very, very funny. It's really well done. I'm thoroughly enjoying the characters and trying to get up to the new episodes in season 3. So if you haven't been watching First Wives Club, it is now on Netflix and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. What?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I believe it's just licensed to Netflix. The first three seasons. I think it's still a BET Plus situation.
The new season is a Netflix series, if I'm not mistaken. But any way that you look at it, the 3 seasons are on Netflix.
Oh, well. Yeah, I was just going to say, I just finished watching whatever they were doing on BET because it was, to your point, it was one of those shows that I initially started watching and then fell off. The pandemic happened. It was originally a show that had four central Black women, and then I believe one of them wouldn't take COVID precautions, and so she got booted, if I'm not mistaken. I might have made that part up.
Well, I'm in season 1, but it's 3, so I don't know, but maybe.
I feel like, or am I confusing it with another Black show with 4? Oh, I am confusing it with another Black show with 4 Black women. I absolutely am, because it was Run the World, I believe.
Wow.
It was Run the World, I believe.
All Black women do not look alike.
Anyway, well, listen, they need to stop making the exact same Living Single show over and over and over and give us something different.
Wow.
Take that.
And I want to give an honorable mention to a new documentary on HBO that I watched last night that I was way more inspired by than I anticipated, of comedian Albert Brooks. It's called Defending My Life. And it is a look at his career through comedy. And if you are a comic, an artist, or, just someone who appreciates the work, I thoroughly enjoyed that. It's over on HBO. And also, as we are wrapping out FANTI, we're excited to tell you about a brand new show that's going to be coming to Maximum Fun. It's not a new show, but it will be new to Maximum Fun. It's called Black People Love Paramore. We've done an episode here with Sequoia Holmes, who hosts the show, and I'm so excited to be welcoming her into the Maximum Fun family. So that brand new show debuts here this week on Maximum Fun, so you can check it out. Black People Love Paramore is about all those different things that Black people supposedly don't love, but really do. And so shout out to Sequoia Holmes and the team putting the show together. We're really excited for y'all to be joining the Maximum Fun family. Last thing I want to give a note on, I've talked about Bill Maher here before, and like as a person who grew up watching Bill Maher and Real Time and Politically Incorrect and all those things, and over the years had a really difficult time trying to like engage it and like have stopped watching it a couple of years ago. On occasion, I will turn it on to see how he and the guests that he have there are discussing different issues. And I made that mistake again last week. And so I was really taken aback by the new rule at the end of the show, where he was talking about the ways in which consumers are boycotting certain different businesses and how, you know, he's sick and tired of it and all of these other kinds of things. There was a piece of data that he cites that says 59% of consumers basically now want to know what companies are supporting with their money, and how he was like so frustrated about it. He talked about the ways that we have these conversations about actors and how we should have actors with lived experiences playing these different roles. He talked about how trans women show up in sports. He talked about posting black squares and racism. He talked about Don't Say Gay in Florida with the Disney story. He talked about Chick-fil-A and homophobia and the boycotts there. And it was just so interesting to me that all of these things that he said he was tired of and didn't care about and was frustrated by, none of these were issues that have any impact on him, because representation isn't something that he needs to be worried about. Transness isn't something he needs to be worried about. Pride and queerness isn't something he needs to be worried about. Racism isn't something he needs to be worried about. And so if your progressivism is only about issues that impact you, it's not progressivism and it's fake. And so I wanted to just call that out because it really, really pissed me off. That said, I'm giving a dishonorable mention to Bill Maher.
Do we consider him to be a progressive?
I don't know who we are, but I think that many people do. I think many people still look at Bill Maher.
Really? Oh, wow.
People still, I mean, he still has this show on HBO where I think that many people are still looking at him as one of like the voices of you know, the progressive movement. And I'm really tired of that because I think that he is one of those people whose progress started regressing a number of years ago and has been really, really frustrating to watch. So dishonorable mention to Bill Maher, New Rules, and Real Time.
That is interesting to me because since we've been doing this show, every single time you bring up that man's name on this show, I want to dry heave, and so to hear that, I guess apparently people still look at him as a voice, perhaps of progressivism, is interesting to say the least, because you just listed all of those things, and that's not to say progressive people can't feel or don't feel, you know, some of the ways that he feels, but you know, we might need to go back to the table to redefine what progressivism mean these days. I don't know.
As linguists ourselves, never mind, not doing that.
Well, go ahead, Fred. Go ahead, Fred.
She said, shake your titties at the camera, bitch. What? Like, come on.
All right, now it is time for Black History is happening every day. Alrighty, so we want to stay on theme this week, and so we're going to be talking a little bit about Native Angelino Susan Burton, who's an activist and the founder of A New Way of Life, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women who are re-entering society after prison, or as she describes, as offering them a second chance. Being formerly incarcerated herself, Burton knew firsthand what it was like trying to recover after prison, not having the tools or resources to rehabilitate herself, and eventually, because of this, ended up back in prison. Burton lived through this cycle with addiction as well, all through the 80s and 90s, and she had a moment of realization that she needed to break the cycle after a prison guard made a comment about seeing her again when Burton was released for the last time.
She was determined to prove this guard wrong. Burton was able to receive care through the Claire Foundation in Santa Monica. Once she was rehabilitated, Burton knew she wanted to help other women in similar circumstances. And in 1998, Burton bought a house and converted it into a house for recently released, formerly incarcerated women, and started the program by going to the bus station where parolees were released and invited women she knew from the system to stay with her. After many years of her community service, Burton has won numerous awards, including the CNN Hero Award in 2010. Burton says, quote, "There are no throwaway people." I respect that and appreciate it. So shout out to Susan Burton. Before we go, we've been on a number of other shows, so we want to let y'all know where y'all can find us on other things. Just last week, Tre'vell and I were on Jade and XD in an episode called The Downfall List. When I tell you the way that we carried
this is
on this episode of Jade and XD.
It was a great time. We should say that I believe Jade and XD, you can get their podcast wherever you get podcasts, wherever you're listening to this one. But if you would like access to the video of our conversation, which is chef's kiss, if I do say so myself, you've got to join their Patreon in order to get access to that. So do what you got to do.
There's that. We are also on an episode of Nerdette. I think this is like our third or fourth time going over on Nerdette. And when I tell you Tre'vell
also carried.
You played in our faces. And we had a really great time. The episode is called Yes, You're an Activist. I will say that I thought the episode should be called Tramp Stamp Region, and I fought for that. You can deal with why that is in the episode. So go check that out. If you do not know comedian Michael Collier, he's probably a name and a face and a voice that you will recognize even if you don't know his name. He is an iconic Black comedian. He has a morning show called the Michael Collier Morning Show. I was on that show on Tuesday morning talking about historically Black phrases, but also about my experience with HIV, having met Michael on a panel that I was on last Friday. So you can go check out the Tuesday edition of the Michael Collier Morning Show. And I'm on there talking about all kinds of different things, and that was a lot of fun with their team. So thank you for inviting me there. As you know, our book, Historically Black Phrases, is available all the different places where you get the good books and the bad books and all the ones in between. You can go find it at historicallyblackphrases.com. Also, We See Each Other, a Black trans journey through TV and film. Tre'vell's new book that came out this year is available. How long can we say new book? I say for a year. Is that right?
I don't think so, beloved, personally, but
Tre'vell's brand new book that just dropped is available wherever you get your book. And also we have a companion podcast called We See Each Other, the podcast co-hosted by none other than the Shar Jossell, who we heard from a little bit earlier. So make sure to go check out all of those streaming episodes of We See Each Other, the podcast. If you're watching us on the YouTube and have not gotten to check out past seasons of this show, or you're checking us out as a podcast because y'all do not be, never mind. Go to FANTIpodcast.com. You can check out all of the past seasons. We are almost at 200 episodes of the show, and really excited to have you check those out. And as we, wrap up here, if you have a comment or suggestion about this week's show, we're at FANTI Podcast on the Instagram, on the Twitter X, on the TikTok, on the YouTube, all using the hashtag FANTIFam. And if you want to contribute a SpeakPipe, you are running out of time to be able to do that. Go to speakpipe.com/FANTI. If you have an email for us, shoot us an email, fanti@maximumfun.org.
Yes, if you'd like to join the Maximum Fun Network and support this fabulous work that they are doing as a worker-owned situation, you can do that at maximumfun.org/join. Our music is brought to you every week by Corece, COR.ECE, wherever you get wonderful music. He just dropped a new song that he's a feature on, so check that out. Our graphics are by Ashley Nguyen and the folks over at Moonhouse Creative. Our editor is Anne-Marie Huber, and our producer is Pamira Muni.
And our senior producer is Laura Swisher.
Booyaka, booyaka.
Oh, this is a production of Maximum Fun.